The price of Bitcoin is going to go up to $10 million a coin. The difference between 2% inflation or 2% deflection per year and 0% deflection or 0% inflation is the difference between an average life expectancy of 70 and immortality. What's the difference between perfect money and imperfect money? Perfect money is economic immortality. Imperfect money is we all have a short, brutal life. The Chinese will embrace Bitcoin. Name a company that's still in existence from 100 years ago off the top of your head where the stock is worth more today in real terms than it was then. What if I told you I could make your company live forever? When you have a need to know, when you have a crisis, if your country is in crisis, if your company is in crisis, if your family is in crisis, when the bank freezes and fails and the currency crashes and you have a business or you have a life and you're in that culture, you have a need to know, your eyes are open, now you adopt Bitcoin. Trump has discovered Bitcoin. Trump has a need to know. Mike, I don't remember, when did we first meet? And you'll say, well, the first time we met, you kicked me out and told me I was a moron. And they're like, oh, I don't remember that at all. Did I do that? I'm sorry I did that. The difference between me swinging a baseball bat at your head while you're looking that way versus me doing this with a baseball bat saying, you should duck, I'm about to swing it, right? One of them is interesting, maybe it's entertaining, and the other is brutal. Fire is scary. People run from the fire. Don't wave the fire in your sister's face. When Apple encounters Bitcoin, I think they may look at it and think, well, wait a minute, Bitcoin, multi-signature, cloud, what if we actually make the Apple Watch a signing device and combine it with the iPhone and combine it with the third signing device on a laptop, and then we do something with the cloud? Maybe the future biggest bank in the world is Apple Computer, and Apple's going to give us easy-to-use, safe multi-sig that 6-year-olds can figure out. How's Bitcoin going to scale? You're going to see a growth in layer 2s, a growth in layer 3s. You're going to see the transactions on layer 1 get bigger. The average transaction size is going to go to 2,000, then 20,000, then 200,000, then 2 million, then 20 million. Do you want the billion people in China to be rich? And do you want to be rich while the Chinese government still has a bunch of laws that you may or may not agree with? Or do you want the people in China to be poor and you to be poor while the Chinese government has a set of laws that you don't agree with? Scientific method, the application of mathematics, disciplined logic, experimentation, engineering, trial and error. If we think about the scientific method applied to astronomy, right? The Copernican revolution and the breakthroughs in astronomy, they came because of a new instrument, right? Advances in optics allowed us to create a telescope. And before the telescope, before that technology, if you will, for 100,000 years, human beings looked up in the sky and they imagined they understood what was going on. And then they filled in the blanks with their superstition and their creativity, and they had their fears and hopes and dreams and religion mixed in with observation. And they somehow got around to concluding that the universe revolved around the earth. And if anybody suggested the universe did not revolve around the earth, they were burned or canceled or ignored. And that's a horrific, wrong theory, and it causes you to make lots of mistakes in navigation. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll never be able to master concepts that would be critical to advancing the civilization. And the scientific revolution applied to astronomy started with the technology. When that telescope was created, we could see the moons of Jupiter. When we could see the moons of Jupiter, we could start to calculate the impact, of the moons of Jupiter, and we could correlate those orbits to what we knew about Kepler's laws and mathematics. And somehow mathematics and physics were impacted by engineering and technology, and they resulted in a profound paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift was, maybe the universe doesn't revolve around the earth. In fact, it seems quite obvious that that's not the way the universe works. And that catapulted us into an entirely new world. And what follows next is Newtonian physics. And after that, the invention of all of the mechanisms that made civilization possible. Economics is pseudoscience before Satoshi. It's a quasi-religious liberal arts, and it's full of people's opinions and prejudices and biases. And in the absence of an instrument, and the instrument in this case is perfect money or proper money. If you don't have an instrument of proper money that doesn't have deflection, then you can't posit a properly functioning economy. And so all of the economists before Satoshi, they were trying to work out the laws of economics with seashells and glass beads and pieces of paper and credit instruments, and those are all imperfect instruments, right? They're so imperfect you could never create a beautiful or a perfect mechanism. And in the absence of the ability to manufacture the perfect mechanism, you can't move forward with scientific advance. So when I say, Bitcoin is singularity where science collides with economics, I mean that we invented an instrument, and the instrument was, it's a combination of, it was the math of cryptography, it was the engineering and the manufacturing of semiconductors. It was the computer science of the internet. And when you put the internet and semiconductors and you put cryptography together with a few insights, you can create this mechanism that we call Bitcoin. And that becomes a mechanism to keep true track of money, to measure true money. When I say it like that, it reminds me of another great scientific revolution. It was John Harrison's invention of the clock, and the perfect maritime clock that could be used to calculate longitude on the ocean. Right before Harrison's clock, there's no way to calculate longitude. Before longitude, we didn't know where we were on the sea. It was a profound breakthrough in the history of navigation. It was made possible by Harrison's clock, and Harrison's clock was a mechanism so precise that you could keep track of universal time, what we called Greenwich Mean Time. Now it's UTE, or universal time. And once you had a mechanism precise enough to keep track of time in Greenwich at the Royal Observatory, you could put it on a ship and you could compare it to a second clock, which kept track of local time, and subtracting the one from the other and multiplying by 15 degrees per hour gave you a longitude. So science advances with the arrival of a certain instrument until you have that instrument. For 100,000 years, you can't calculate longitude, right? Until you have the telescope for 100,000 years, you can't see the moons of Jupiter, and you can't figure out Kepler's laws really work. You just can't. You could posit, but you can't prove. Before cryptography and the internet and modern semiconductors, you couldn't create a Bitcoin. If you can't create a Bitcoin, you can't create perfect money. If you don't have perfect money, then you can't actually posit an economy where the money doesn't deflect, where the money is true. When the money becomes true, the money is the asset which is used to channel capital through time and space, right? The essence of economics is the proper allocation of capital. And so Satoshi gave us a perfect money. The perfect money made it possible to capture, to store, to channel, to distribute capital, to program capital in an economy. And how profound is that? Well, I mean, the difference between 2% inflation or 2% deflection per year and 0% deflection or 0% inflation is the difference between an average life expectancy of 70 and immortality. Right? We figured out how not to die. Right? It's pretty profound, right? When you think about it like that, what's the difference between perfect money and imperfect money? Perfect money is economic immortality. Imperfect money is we all have a short, brutal life, right? Terminated early. There's a time when there's a 40% infant mortality rate between the ages of 0 and 5, right? Your kids are going to die. There's a time when the likelihood that a woman giving birth dies in childbirth was like 30%, right? You know, before science crashed into medicine, you know, your children were more likely than not to die. You know, your wife was more likely than not to die in childbirth. If you got her pregnant 3 times, it was a death sentence. And so you think about life before science impinged on medicine, pretty big deal. You think about science impinging upon astronomy, a pretty big deal. Science, you know, blasting into navigation, right? Pretty big deal. And creature in modern society is the corporation. The average life expectancy of a corporation is something like 10 years. You create a company and it lasts more than 10 years, then you've lived longer than most. The number of corporations that are more than 100 years old, right? What percentage of people live to be more than 100? Like 0.1% or 0.01%? What percentage of corporations live to be more than 100? 0.0001%. Well, what if I told you I could make your company live forever? Right? It's so how profound. We're talking about eliminating corporate mortality, right? We're talking about stretching economic vitality easily by a factor of 10, maybe by a factor of 100, maybe by a factor of a million. So, you know, how will it change society? Well, it won't change society uniformly the same everywhere. It's like, you know, Gibson says the future's already with us, but it's not evenly distributed, right? In the modern world today, there are people in New York City that live in skyscrapers up 80 floors, and there are people that live in Africa in mud huts, you know? And you can find certain peoples that are still stuck in Neolithic Stone Age cultures if you look hard enough. And you can find people that if the electricity was turned off to their elevator, they die, right? And so very, very, very profound difference. I think you got to look at Bitcoin is this pure digital capital, which means it's the technology to capitalize a family, capitalize an individual, capitalize a corporation, capitalize an institution, a charity, a nonprofit, or a country or a city, so or a university, right? You know, we throw away throw around the word capitalize as a colloquialism, like, oh, you're going to capitalize on that? Okay, but if you think, and that's because economics has been pseudoscience and capital has been kind of a liberal arts type word. If you walked up to people on the street and said, what do you think capital is? And you asked them before Satoshi or before then it said Bitcoin, it's not clear what they would give you as an answer. They would, say something about Karl Marx said it was bad or capitalists do something with it, but it's such a fuzzy word. But in the aftermath of Bitcoin, capital is economic energy, and I give you an asset to store economic energy. And now, if I can store economic energy in a digital asset, I can move the capital potentially at the speed of light at high frequency. So I can move it through space, right? Can you actually oscillate capital at 10 megahertz? You can oscillate, you can create a 10 megahertz signal right? 10 kilohertz signal you could probably hear, right? So at certain frequencies, when you're vibrating energy, right, you get a result. Capital's never been something we could work with, we could program. So Bitcoin allows you to program and channel capital through time and space. And in time, it means that we have the hope of addressing things like global payments for 8 billion people at the speed of light off of mobile phones with no intermediary, right? So that's interesting. How do I actually do 100 transactions a second if I'm an AI bot and I want to trip through cyberspace, right? I mean, that's interesting. You won't do that without digital energy or digital capital. But the other issue is, well, how do you actually send a bunch of capital forward in time 100 years, right? And you can't do it with gold. You can't do it with a building. You can't do it with a share of stock. I mean, name a company that's still in existence from 100 years ago off the top of your head where the stock is worth more today in real terms than it was then. It'd be kind of challenging, right? So projecting economic energy through time and space has really been more of an aspirational fantasy, right? Or an art than it was ever a science or engineering discipline. Bitcoin, it takes something from the artistic and from the religious and from the political domain, and it moves it into the engineering domain where now there is actually a precise way to move capital around, to store capital, to capitalize. And I guess your question is, how will the world change? Profoundly, right? I mean, I can create an AI that can live in cyberspace capitalized by Bitcoin that will live forever, that'll have economic mortality, that is completely sovereign from a company, a person, a country. That AI could, in theory, split itself, go viral and spawn 10 million more AIs that are all sovereign. Mm-hmm. It's a life form, right? It's right. I can endow a university, a nonprofit, a foundation with Bitcoin that could conceivably last 1,000 years without anybody working for it, right? I can create new types of entities. I can create companies that don't have a life expectancy of 10 years, and I can create a company with a likely life expectancy of 100 or 500 or 1,000 years. I can have different missions. I can think differently about how I capitalize or finance my country. I think differently about how I build. Every product and service could be different, right? If you think about products that are around us all the time, life insurance,